Who doesn't love a good academic hoax? I know I do. And what kind of a loser would fall for a hoax? Let's find out. This video is about the Grievance Studies Hoax and the much more recent Quillette Hoax. People have been comparing the two because they involve the same sort of segment of internet society, that being the intellectual dark web, as well as their friends and foes. The first hoax was against the postmodernists. That is, the postmodernists got duped. And then the second hoax was against the anti-postmodernists. And people have been debating which hoax was hoaxier. The recent Quillette hoax has caused me to revisit my opinions about the initial Grievance Studies hoax. So just so you have an idea of where I'm coming from, I've always been in favor broadly of social justice. I'm on the left economically and socially. I've been called an SJW, a libtard, and a feminazi, so I think that qualifies me. But I've been wary of the direction things have been headed with social justice politics since around 2010 or so, I feel like is when things started to really shift. That's when I noticed a sudden escalation and excessive amounts of language policing, oppression Olympics, a lot of concept creep coming along. And it's been steadily escalating until now, where everything is problematic and everyone is a Nazi. So when I learned about the Grievance Studies hoax in 2018, it felt like a small victory for people like me who were starting to get really tired of that shit. To review, the Grievance Studies hoax was a project where 3 academics wrote a bunch of shitty academic papers reminiscent of what you might find in the critical studies literature. That's your queer studies, your critical race theory, gender studies, fat studies, and they dubbed these the Grievance Studies literature. If you follow New Real Peer Review on Twitter, you'll understand what it was they were going for. Their logic was, if a bunch of non-experts can write a bunch of nonsense and it gets accepted to all these top journals, what does it say about the state of the scholarship in these fields? This was dubbed Sokal Squared as a sort of sequel to the original Sokal affair, a very similar but completely separate hoax that occurred in the 1990s, where a physics professor submitted a paper filled with gobbledygook, talking about how physical reality is a social construct, to some postmodern journal, and it got accepted. This started a whole conversation about, have we gone too far with this whole everything is a social construct business? So back to Grievance Studies, back to 2018. By the time they were found out, 7 of the 20 papers they had submitted had been accepted for publication. Most famous of these was probably the dark park rape culture one, where they claimed to study the rape culture happening at dog parks. There was one about fat bodybuilding, or bodybuilding as a fat person, I guess. There was one where they replaced some of the text in Hitler's Mein Kampf to make it sound more intersectional. There was an ethnography of a Hooters restaurant, so this would have been someone doing field work at a Hooters and analyzing the power dynamics there. But the most famous of these was probably the conceptual penis one, where they talked about how the penis is a social construct, it's not really a male sex organ, and at one point they even mentioned that it's probably in a way responsible for climate change. So like I said, when I first learned about this, it felt like comeuppance. I thought maybe the types of people who talk about how buttons are transphobic or whatever's the shitty hot take of the day would feel a little stupid, and that felt satisfying to me. I thought maybe people drawing excessively on these kinds of extreme analyses would pump the brakes a little bit. Also, most of the initial criticisms that were coming out about the project I found to be pretty weak. Criticism number 1 that came up a lot was that the hoax was a violation of academic integrity. So because the hoaxers faked their identities and didn't tell the peer reviewers ahead of time that they were going to be pranked, they didn't go through the standard research ethics protocol where you're supposed to obtain consent when you're involving humans in your research study. The argument was that they violated academic integrity. This is stupid. I mean, yeah, they kind of did, but that's the only way you'd be able to pull something like this off. It's not very nice to the peer reviewers or the journals, but I think ultimately that's not really what's at stake here. Criticism number 2 is that peer review relies on good faith submissions. That's also a fair point and something to consider, but it doesn't outright demolish the hoax either. The point is, non-experts were able to very convincingly mimic the language and the arguments of the so-called Grievance Studies and successfully prank these prestigious academic journals. Or were they? It wasn't until much later, after I started becoming disillusioned with the IDW, just as I had been with the social justice movement before, that I reflected further on some of these criticisms and came across some better ones. which the hoaxsters didn't really have good answers to. So first of all, I found out that the fake papers to sociology journals had all been rejected. Their paper, The Conceptual Penis, which was probably their most famous one, was published in Cogent Social Sciences Journal, which is apparently a low-quality publication that charges a fee to publish. When they tried to publish it in a more reputable journal, it was rejected. I also learned that this was a full-time job for James Lindsay, one of the hoaxsters, who spent like 90 hours a week on this project, he said. This wasn't like the original Sokal debacle, where Alan Sokal wrote a bunch of gibberish and just got it published. I'm pretty sure if I was spending 90 hours a week trying to prank like a fucking medical journal, I could do it. You could probably fake data and get it into a publication anywhere if it was convincing enough. I'm sure viewers are aware of like the replication crisis going on in psychology, economics, and medicine. This isn't really specific to the critical studies literature. One good example, they had one paper where they talked about how masturbation was a form of non-consensual violence. Now, this paper was rejected, but the reviewer recognized the comments they made when the hoaxsters published their comments. The reviewer explained, I don't really like reviews that reject the premise of the paper outright. I tried to buy into the paper and offer some paths forward, even though, at the end of the day, they did reject it. That's the important bit. But these are the comments that the hoax authors quoted in their write-up. And as a larger point, one of the big problems with the hoax is that despite doing all of this work, and it being a year later, the hoaxsters still don't seem to understand the purpose of theoretical inquiry. They think that any discipline based on the subjective is bad, but anytime you're trying to make a moral argument, you're making normative claims. You can't objectively prove what a better world is going to look like. It depends on what you value and what is your conception of the good. Not everything can be subjected to a randomized controlled trial. We can use reason to make sense of the world, and sometimes we might want to use colorful language to persuade. Is there a lot of junk being published in the name of social justice? Sure. But is this a significant proportion of the research literature? Not really. The reason I even realized this was because after I learned about the hoax and thought it was funny, I started following some of the hoaxsters on Twitter and realized they basically have the same 3 lukewarm takes that they recycle over and over again. The first time you hear someone say something like this, you might find it funny and fresh if you've just come out of like a Soviet-style language cop environment. But after you hear James Lindsay say for the 40th time that you're talking to an expert on social justice here, I published a paper in a preeminent critical theory journal, I know what I'm talking about. It's like, get a new thing. And they're such hypocrites. They accuse SJWs of being paranoid because they see white supremacy and rapists everywhere or whatever. And okay, sure, the paranoia about the bad white man is borderline pathological in some spaces, I agree. Mostly just on Twitter, though. But then James Lindsay calls the professional loser group Antifa throwing milkshakes at people terrorism. And then when called on this by an actual expert in terrorism, he calls it petulant terrorism, says LOL, and then blocks him. They're also constantly using their subjective experience to justify their points. Like Helen Pluckrose is like, I don't know any men who don't think women aren't funny. Like, okay, that's not a legitimate claim according to your own fucking crusade. The hoaxster's logic is also dangerous. Should we permit the gatekeepers of knowledge to write off anything that doesn't immediately make sense to them? That sounds exactly like the opposite of the model of the group the hoaxsters claim to be a part of, which is roughly, like I said, this intellectual dark web group, who claim to be all about engaging with dangerous, difficult ideas that aren't convenient, but, really only the ones that they like. Or as these critics of the hoax put it, to publish is to invite response, dissent, and critical engagement, not to have the final word, which is more or less the model that Quillette boasts, Quillette being an online publication for anyone critical of mainstream SJW-isms. That brings us to the much more recent Quillette Hoax, which was in a much smaller scale, and it's being talked about like it's sort of the mirror image of the Grievance Studies Hoax. What happened this time is that some random guy pretended to be a construction worker in the DSA, that's the Democratic Socialists of America, named Archie Carter. He wrote a paper called DSA is Doomed, where he talked about how everyone in the DSA is just a woke, privileged hipster that doesn't care about ordinary people. So Quillette published the piece, and then the guy revealed that he made it all up. So left and centrist Twitter was all ha ha. Now, I think an opinion piece is very different from an academic paper. It's a lot harder to vet someone's opinion, like their personal experience, literally, individually, versus making sure someone's cited the literature properly and their arguments are sound in an academic paper. I do think the standards are a bit different. I've also heard dozens of real people make exactly these types of arguments in the Archie Carter piece, whether they dabbled with the DSA or some related group. So I guess I have some sympathy because I wouldn't be that surprised if something like that showed up on my desk as an editor. But there is some weird shit in there, like there's this quote, "I would approach political activity with this maxim in mind. What would Alinsky do?" I don't actually know who the fuck Alinsky is. Apparently this is a reference to a guy who actual Marxists don't really care for. I thought this tweet put it very nicely, like, hey, if Quillette had some actual viewpoint diversity on their board, like they claim to love, like if they had an actual Marxist, they probably would have been able to raise a few red flags about this. So Quillette published a retraction. They said they were going to do better, which, hey, is more than any one of the more rabid critical theorists said when they got duped. Then I saw James Lindsay, one of the hoaxsters, say, hey, it happens, we all have our biases, which is so not the measured approach he normally takes when it's a postmodernist getting pranked. But that's okay. I've given up on anyone being consistent about anything in this day and age. I'll end this video with a quote from Alan Sokal, the original hoaxster, a patron saint of academic hoaxes. The results of my little experiment demonstrate, at the very least, that some fashionable sectors of the American academic left have been getting intellectually lazy. The editors of Social Text, that was the journal that published his fake article, liked my article because they liked its conclusion. They apparently felt no need to analyze the quality of the evidence, the cogency of the arguments, or even the relevance of the arguments to the purported conclusion. And this applies just as much to the anti-SJWs as it does to the SJWs. This applies to both the Quillette Hoax and the Grievance Studies Hoax, in a way. In conclusion, both of these hoaxes served a good purpose, which is to kind of keep editors on their toes and make people more aware of the fact that they're always going to be looking for things that flatter their preconceptions, but are being blown way out of proportion on both sides. Both sides have massive cognitive biases and think falsely that they're saving the world from the worst of the other side, but in many cases are just prolonging the stupid culture war. It's like a Mexican standoff where everyone's got their guns drawn and no one wants to be the first to take the other side charitably. So, do you think that one hoax or the other was more embarrassing for the other side? Do you think I'm wrong? Leave a comment and let me know.